I went camping with a few friends one summer, not long after we all finished college. We picked a quiet spot deep in the mountains, somewhere far from any official campground. The area was open forest with a small stream running through it and just enough flat space for our tents. We wanted peace. No noise, no crowds. Just the quiet of the woods and a few nights away from the constant pull of work and people. We hiked in about 3 miles, carrying everything we needed. The trail wound through thick trees that blocked most of the sunlight, but once we reached the clearing, the forest opened up enough to see the stars at night. We set up camp right beside the stream. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth rocks that made a soft, steady sound through the night. We built a fire, ate, and sat around for hours just listening to the woods. It was quiet, only the sound of insects and the occasional branch snapping somewhere off in the trees. That first night was calm. The second night, though, changed everything. We were sitting around the fire again after dinner. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and the forest had that heavy silence that comes after a long day. The air was still and cool. I was staring into the fire, half asleep, when I noticed a faint light moving through the trees on the far side of the clearing. It was steady, not flickering like a flashlight being waved around, but low and controlled, like someone walking carefully with it pointed at the ground. At first, I thought maybe it was another group camping nearby, someone walking back to their tent after going off to use the woods. But there shouldn't have been anyone else out there. We hadn't passed a single other camper or hiker on the trail in. The light stopped just at the edge of the trees, maybe 30 yards away. I could make out the shape of a man standing there. He was motionless, facing toward us. The firelight flickered enough to show part of his face, but not clearly. He stood there for a long time, longer than made sense. Then he slowly turned and walked back into the darkness. The light disappeared completely, like he turned it off. I didn't say anything to the others. Everyone was tired, and I told myself it was probably someone from a different camp, even though I knew there wasn't another one for miles. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing sounds, soft footsteps, faint cracks of twigs, but every time I looked out of my tent, I saw nothing. The next morning, everything felt normal again. We cooked breakfast, packed our day packs, and went for a short hike. The air smelled fresh, and the woods were calm. But when we came back to camp, something was different. All of our gear had been moved, not stolen, just rearranged. The sleeping bags were folded neatly, the cookware cleaned and stacked, the trash bag tied shut. It was strange, but also oddly organized, like someone had been trained to keep things tidy. Even the ashes of the fire pit had been cleared, and the logs were placed in a near-perfect circle. It gave me a weird feeling. No animal could have done that, and none of us had touched anything before leaving. Whoever it was hadn't taken a single thing, but they'd gone through everything. Every zipper, every bag. I checked my pack and found it still full, but even my clothes were folded now. The rest of the group laughed it off as maybe one of us trying to freak the others out, but I knew that wasn't it. There was no reason for anyone to hike out there, go through our things, and then leave without taking anything. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I stayed awake long after the others went to sleep. The fire was down to glowing coals, and the forest was dark. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps again. Soft, measured, careful. Not the kind of sound animals make. I could tell whoever it was knew how to move quietly. I unzipped my tent just enough to see out. The moonlight was faint but enough to show a figure standing near the trees again. This time, he was closer. He stood facing the camp, head tilted slightly, like he was studying everything. He wasn't holding a light this time. He just stood there in complete stillness. I could barely make out his outline, broad shoulders, short hair, dark jacket. I stayed frozen, trying to breathe quietly. After maybe a minute, he turned away and disappeared again into the forest. The next morning, we found the camp cleaner than ever. The ashes were gone again, everything neatly stacked, and the rocks we used for sitting were placed in a perfect ring around where the fire had been. It was eerie how precise it was, almost like military discipline. We packed up that day and left early. Nobody said much. Something about the place felt wrong. I didn't see him again on the way out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching us the whole time from somewhere in the trees. A week later, when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went online and started reading about strange camping encounters in that region. That's when I found a local news article about a man who had been arrested the year before for attacking a group of campers less than 20 miles from where we had been. He'd been a former soldier who had gone off the grid after leaving the army. The article said he was trained in field survival, stealth, and tracking. It mentioned that he had approached several camps in the area over the years, sometimes stealing, sometimes just watching. In one case, he killed a man and disappeared for months before being caught again. The detail that stuck out most was that, according to the report, he had a strange habit of cleaning up after himself. Police found campsites he'd stayed at where everything was neatly arranged, fire pits buried, trash burned. Even the victims' tents were cleaned and zipped up before he left. He'd been arrested again, but not long after, he escaped during transport. The article said they believed he might still be somewhere in those mountains. That explained everything. The way our things had been arranged, the silent figure, the steady light in the dark. I realized we had probably been within a few yards of him more than once, and the only reason we were still alive was that, for some reason, he hadn't decided to act that night. Maybe he was too tired, maybe he was high, or maybe, for whatever reason, he just didn't feel like doing it. I've thought about it many times since then, how close he was, how he stood there watching us, probably deciding what to do. Maybe he had every intention of killing one of us and then cleaning up after, like he always did. But something stopped him. Maybe he didn't trust the situation. Maybe he saw movement, thought we were armed, or thought someone else was nearby. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that he was there, and we never knew how close we were to dying. Now, every time I go camping, I can't sit around a fire without thinking about that quiet man standing at the edge of the trees. Not a ghost. Not a story, just a person who could have taken everything from us, but didn't. Sometimes I wonder what changed his mind that night. And sometimes, when I think about how neatly he cleaned everything, I wonder if he still camps out there somewhere, waiting for another group to stumble across the same quiet clearing, leaving it spotless after they're gone. It was late summer when I decided to take a few days off and go camping alone. I'd been working too many hours, sitting behind a desk, barely seeing the sun. I needed quiet, real quiet, the kind you only get deep in the woods, where the air smells like pine and dirt, and you can hear water moving somewhere far away. I picked a spot I'd been to once before, up near a small lake that barely showed up on maps. The drive took hours, most of it on cracked two-lane roads that turned into gravel, then dirt, and finally into a rough trail that could barely fit a single vehicle. I had packed light, a small tent, sleeping bag, a cooler, and enough food for 3 days. I didn't plan on seeing anyone out there. By the time I arrived, the sun was already sliding behind the trees. The lake was calm, reflecting the fading orange light. The place was empty. I parked near a clearing, unloaded my gear, and started setting up camp. The smell of the woods hit me right away, clean, sharp, mixed with the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. Felt good. Felt far away from everything. After the tent was up and the firewood stacked, I made something simple to eat and sat watching the water. The sky went from gold to purple to black. Crickets started up, and the air cooled down fast. I remember staring into the fire, my mind blank for the first time in months. That's when I heard something faint across the lake. Maybe a branch breaking, or something stepping through the shallows. I looked up, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the firelight. Probably just a deer or raccoon, I thought. You hear things like that all the time when you camp alone. The night passed quietly after that. I woke up around 3 to use the bathroom and noticed how still everything was. The kind of silence that makes you realize how much noise fills normal life. Traffic, phones, electricity humming. Out there, the silence felt thick. When I crawled back into the tent, I could hear my own breathing loud against it. The next morning, I walked down to the lake and washed my face in the cold water. Mist hung low over the surface, rolling slow and gray. It was beautiful and eerie at the same time. I spent most of the day hiking around the edge, following game trails through thick brush. There were signs of animals everywhere. Tracks in the mud, broken branches, the smell of something musky hanging near the shore. I never saw anyone, though. Not a single person, not even a boat in the distance. That night, I built another fire. The woods came alive again with the usual night sounds. Insects, frogs, something rustling occasionally in the underbrush. I was halfway through a can of beer when I noticed a smell, faint but out of place. It was like burnt rubber or oil, something chemical. I stood up and looked around, thinking maybe something in my gear was melting near the fire, but everything looked fine. The smell drifted away after a few minutes, and I went back to the fire. Later, when I turned in for the night, the forest felt different. The sounds were still there, but uneven, like everything was pausing in between. It made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it and pulled my sleeping bag tight, telling myself it was just nerves from being alone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted out there. Around midnight, I woke up again. The fire outside had burned down, but there was a faint orange glow still visible through the tent. I could hear something faint. Not movement, not an animal, just breathing. It was slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere near the fire. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself it was in my head, that it was the wind, but the air was completely still. I stayed frozen, listening. After a few seconds, I heard the sound of dirt shifting, like someone taking a step, then another. It wasn't quick or panicked. It was slow, steady, as if whoever or whatever it was didn't care if I heard it. The steps moved closer to the tent. My first instinct was to grab the small hatchet I kept next to my sleeping bag. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. I just waited. The steps stopped just outside, close enough that I could hear the crunch of the soil settling. Then nothing. I must have stayed like that for 10 minutes, holding my breath, trying to keep quiet. Eventually, the silence swallowed everything again. I didn't sleep much after that. When dawn came, the sunlight felt unreal, too bright after that long night. When I finally unzipped the tent, everything looked normal. The fire pit was still there, cold and gray, nothing disturbed. The only thing that stood out were the footprints, faint, half-pressed into the soft dirt. Not mine. They were larger, spaced differently, and they circled the camp once before disappearing into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I packed up early that morning. I told myself I was just being cautious, that it was probably another camper walking through late at night. But I hadn't seen anyone for miles, and the prints looked fresh, like they'd been made just before sunrise. On the drive out, I couldn't stop thinking about the smell from the night before, that faint chemical odor. The idea hit me later that someone could have been camping nearby, using something to start fires or cook, maybe even living out there long term. Still, the prints circling my tent didn't fit that. They weren't passing by. They were lingering. When I finally reached town, I stopped at a small gas station to fill up. The man at the counter asked where I was coming from, and when I told him the name of the lake, he raised his eyebrows. He said not many people went up there anymore, that a few years back there had been some trouble with a drifter living in those woods. I didn't ask what kind of trouble, but I didn't have to. The way he looked at me said enough. That night, back home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound outside made me tense. I thought about those footprints again, about the slow, calm steps in the dark. Whoever it was hadn't tried to hurt me, hadn't even made a sound beyond that breathing. But that was what made it worse. The quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to rush. A few weeks later, I saw a small news article online. It mentioned an unmarked camp found in the same area. Bits of old food, burned trash, a tattered sleeping bag, and signs of someone living there for a long time. The sheriff said it looked abandoned. No one knew who had been there or how long they'd been gone. I knew right away that it had to be the same person. The smell, the footprints, the breathing, it all made sense. Someone had been watching that lake, staying hidden just far enough away to see who came and went. I'd just been unlucky enough to set up too close. I never went back to that area again. Every time I think about camping now, that night plays in my head. The dark outside the tent, the slow crunch of dirt underfoot, the silence afterward. I realized then how fragile that feeling of safety is when you're out there alone, with nothing but thin fabric between you and the unknown. It wasn't the woods that scared me. It was knowing that someone else was out there, close enough to hear me breathe, standing still in the dark while I tried to sleep. And the worst part is they never did anything. They didn't steal, didn't speak, didn't attack. They just watched. That's what makes it stick with me, because I'll never know how long they were there before I noticed, or how many other people they watched before me. It was years ago now, but I still remember every detail of that camping trip. Not because something wild or supernatural happened, but because of how normal it all seemed until I started putting the pieces together afterward. The kind of story that doesn't leave you with answers, only that heavy, unsettled feeling that stays in your chest for years. We used to go camping in the same spot every summer near Kearney, Ontario. A familiar place, a clearing by a small lake surrounded by thick trees, far enough from the main road that you felt cut off from the world, but close enough that you could hike back to the car if you needed to. It became a tradition among a group of us, same time every year. We'd set up the tents in a big circle with the fire pit in the middle, everyone's gear stacked neatly, coolers in the shade. We always brought too much beer, too little food, and the plan was never more than to relax, drink, and forget the outside world for a few days. That year started no different. The air was warm, and the sun was still high when we arrived. You could hear the faint hum of insects over the sound of the lake. The smell of pine and smoke from nearby campfires carried through the air. We spent most of the afternoon setting up, passing around drinks, and cracking jokes while the fire pit filled with kindling. By nightfall, the flames were up, the smoke rolling steady, and the laughter bouncing between the trees. It was sometime after dark, maybe close to midnight, when he showed up. None of us heard him approach. He just walked into the glow of our fire like he'd stepped through the woods from nowhere. He said his name, I can't remember what it was, and mentioned he was in the military, camping out nearby for a few days. Said his firewood was wet and asked if he could join us. He didn't seem dangerous. If anything, he seemed ordinary. Average height, lean build, mid-30s maybe. His clothes were worn, a little dirty like he'd been out for a while. He smiled a lot, had that overly calm way of talking some people in the military pick up. Polite, steady, nothing strange. We were all a little drunk and high by then, so no one saw a reason to say no. He tossed a few bucks toward the firewood fund and sat down. The night went on easy enough after that. He didn't talk much, but listened to everyone else, sometimes laughing at something someone said. Eventually, one by one, people started turning in for the night. I was one of the last to crawl into my tent, the fire still glowing low and quiet. I fell asleep fast. I woke up later, not sure what time, but it was still dark. The fire outside was going again, crackling bright, and I could hear someone talking softly. My first thought was that someone else in the group couldn't sleep and had gotten up to stoke the fire. When I unzipped the tent just enough to peek through, I saw him, the stranger, sitting alone on the log, staring into the flames, mumbling to himself. The words were too quiet to make out, just low sounds, almost rhythmic. For a second, I thought maybe he was talking on the phone, but there was no light, no movement, just him and the fire. The way he sat was strange, too, completely still except for his lips moving. His eyes were locked on the flames like he wasn't really seeing them. I remember sitting there, half hidden, trying to decide whether to say something or pretend I didn't see him. But I was still buzzed, my brain foggy, and the idea of getting up to confront some random guy at 4 in the morning didn't sound appealing. I told myself he was harmless, maybe just drunk or tripping a little, and went back inside. I lay there listening to the faint sound of him talking until I finally drifted off again. By morning, he was gone. His campsite, which had been visible just down the path, was empty. No tent, no trash, no tracks, nothing. It looked like no one had been there at all. We all started talking about it over breakfast, trying to piece together who had last seen him, when he'd left, whether he'd mentioned moving on. The strange part was no one saw him pack up. The last 2 people awake said he was still there around 3:30 a.m., and the first person up the next morning said the site was empty by 6. The rest of the weekend went on normally, but that moment never left my head. The way he'd been talking to himself by the fire, the blank stare, Maybe it was just harmless weirdness, but something about it didn't sit right. When you're that deep in the woods, surrounded by people you know, a stranger slipping into that circle changes the entire feeling of safety. We joked about it later, the mystery camper who vanished without a trace. Every year afterward, someone brought it up again, always with a laugh. I eventually forgot about it, mostly. Then, about 4 or 5 years later, I was at home, flipping through channels, not paying much attention, when a photo flashed across the screen. The face looked familiar enough to make me stop. It was the same calm expression, same lean build, same eyes, older now, maybe, but unmistakable. The man on the screen had been arrested for multiple murders across the province. The newscaster said he'd been living off-grid for years, camping and drifting between towns. I sat there frozen, trying to convince myself it couldn't be the same person. But the memory hit too cleanly. That night by the fire, the quiet, the stillness, the mumbling. It all lined up in a way that made my stomach twist. I couldn't be sure, of course. It's easy to convince yourself two faces match when you want a story to fit. But deep down, I knew I'd seen that same man. I went digging later, looking up everything I could about his case. The timeline didn't completely line up, but there was overlap. He'd been active around that same period, in that same region. It's possible I'm wrong, that it was just some other guy who happened to look the same. But I've gone over the memory enough times to know my brain isn't just making it up. What stuck with me most wasn't the fear of what could have happened. It was realizing how normal he'd seemed. If you passed him on the street, you'd never think twice. He smiled, he laughed a little, he fit in like anyone else sitting around a fire. There was nothing about him that screamed danger. That's what makes it so unsettling. You spend a night beside someone like that, share food, share warmth, and you have no idea what kind of thoughts are moving behind that calm face. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes, late at night, when I'm camping again or even just sitting by a backyard fire, that memory slips back. The glow of the flames, the quiet of the forest, and the faint image of someone sitting there, whispering to himself just beyond the light. It taught me something I didn't expect, that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly, blending in, waiting for the right moment. You might never even know how close you came to it. When I tell this story now, I don't claim it as proof I met a killer. I don't dramatize it. I keep it exactly as it happened. A simple night, a stranger, a memory that only felt strange in hindsight. And maybe that's what makes it truly scary, because there's no closure, no headline that ties everything together neatly. Just a quiet night in the woods and a face I'll never forget. The ending is that I'll never know for sure. Maybe it really was him, maybe it wasn't. But every time I see a fire burning low and hear the faint crackle of wood, I can still picture him sitting there, perfectly still, eyes fixed on the flames, whispering something only he could hear. That uncertainty is what stays with me, because it's not the monsters in stories that scare me anymore. It's the people who seem perfectly normal right up until they aren't. Every summer for as long as I can remember, a few of us used to go camping up near Kearney, Ontario. It was our place. Quiet, surrounded by thick pine forest and calm water, far enough from the main road that you could sit by the fire and hear nothing but the crackle of wood and the wind pushing through the trees. It became a kind of tradition for us, something we did to reset after long months of work. We always set up our tents in the same way, forming a big circle with the fire pit right in the middle like a camp version of home. That year was no different. There were maybe 7 or 8 of us, and we brought everything we needed for a long weekend. Coolers of beer, bags of food, folding chairs, and enough wood to keep a fire going for days. We set up the tents, got the fire burning, and settled into that easy rhythm that comes with camping. No schedules, no noise, no one else around. As night came, the woods darkened fast. The temperature dropped, and the air smelled of smoke and pine sap. We started drinking, passing bottles around the circle. A few of us lit joints, and a couple of people were tripping hard on mushrooms, laughing at the way the firelight danced on the trees. Everything felt distant and slow, like the whole night was stretched out. At some point, maybe close to midnight, a man walked out of the darkness and straight into our circle. It startled me a little because we hadn't seen anyone else since we arrived. He wasn't loud or threatening, just calm. He looked like he'd been hiking or maybe camping nearby. I remember him saying he was in the military and was taking a vacation to clear his head. He said he didn't have firewood and asked if he could join us. He looked ordinary enough, maybe mid-30s, average build, clean-shaven. He wore dark clothes, maybe a green jacket, and carried a small pack. There was something about the way he stood, straight, controlled, not like a normal camper relaxing for the night. But we were too relaxed to care. Someone handed him a drink, he gave a few bucks for the firewood, and that was that. The night went on like normal. We talked, laughed, listened to music on a small speaker. The man didn't say much. He mostly listened and watched the fire, occasionally nodding or giving short answers when someone said something to him. I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just one of those quiet types who liked to sit back and take things in. One by one, people started heading off to bed. I was maybe the second or third to crawl into my tent. The fire was still burning, and a few people were still awake talking when I zipped myself inside. The sound of the firewood crackling and the occasional laugh drifted through the night until it faded into silence. Sometime later, must have been around 4 in the morning, I woke up. The air inside my tent felt cold, and I could see the faint glow of the fire through the fabric. I heard a voice outside, low and steady. For a moment, I thought 2 people were still up talking, but when I listened carefully, it was just one voice. I unzipped the corner of my tent and peered out. The man from earlier was sitting on one of the logs by the fire. He was alone, leaning forward slightly, his face lit by the orange glow. The fire had been restoked, fresh wood, bright flames. He was talking to himself, quiet but constant, his lips moving fast like he was having a full conversation that only he could hear. I remember staring at him for a few seconds, frozen. Part of me wanted to go out there and ask if he was okay, but I was still half out of it, maybe still feeling the mushrooms from earlier. I told myself it was nothing, just some guy muttering to himself. Maybe he couldn't sleep. Maybe he was drunk. I pulled the zipper closed and lay there listening. His voice rose and fell, sometimes mumbling, sometimes whispering. It went on for a long time. I eventually drifted back to sleep, the firelight flickering faintly through the tent walls. When I woke up again, it was bright outside. The fire had burned down to ash, and the air smelled like smoke and damp wood. Everyone was awake, moving around, cooking breakfast, laughing. The weirdness of the night before slipped away fast, replaced by the normal lazy morning energy of camping. Then someone mentioned the guy. They asked if anyone had seen him that morning. Nobody had. His tent, set up in the next site over, was empty. There was no sign of him. No fire, no trash, no gear, nothing. The place looked untouched, like no one had ever been there. Even the dirt where his tent had been didn't look disturbed. We talked about it for a while, trying to piece together the timeline. The last 2 people awake said he was still sitting by the fire around 3:30. The first person who got up that morning said he was gone by 6. No one heard him pack up. No footsteps, no car, no sound of movement. Just gone. It was weird, but after a while we laughed it off. Maybe he liked to leave early. Maybe he hiked out before sunrise. It wasn't worth overthinking. The rest of the weekend went perfectly fine. We fished, swam, cooked big meals, and sat around the fire every night. But I kept thinking about waking up to him sitting there talking to himself. The way he stared into the fire like something was wrong inside him. We finished the trip and drove home like we always did, tired but happy. After a few days, it just became another memory, another camping story to tell when someone asked about weird things that happen in the woods. Years passed. Life went on. The group stopped camping as often, people got jobs, moved, started families. I hadn't thought about that night in years until one afternoon I turned on the TV and saw a news report about a man who'd been arrested for a string of murders across Ontario. They showed his face on the screen, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I knew that face. It wasn't just a vague resemblance, it was him. The same eyes, same jawline, same expression. The man who had walked into our firelight that night years ago. The same man who sat there until dawn whispering to himself while the rest of us slept a few feet away. The report went on about the details, how he'd moved around from place to place, camping in remote areas, picking victims at random. They listed dates and towns, and I realized he had been active around the same time we were up north. It hit me how easily something could have gone wrong that night. I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself that it might just be someone who looked like him. But my mind wouldn't let it go. Every little detail came back. The way he didn't blink much, the strange calmness, the fact that his sight looked untouched the next morning. It all fit too well. I never told anyone in the group what I saw on the news. I didn't see the point. It had been too long and there was no proof. No photos, no records, nothing but memory. But sometimes when I think back to that night, I replay how it could have gone differently. If one of us had stayed up later, if someone had said the wrong thing, if he had decided to do something else instead of just sit there whispering by the fire, we'd been half drunk, half stoned, asleep in thin nylon tents while a man like that sat among us with who knows what going through his mind. That's what stuck with me most. Not the possibility that it was him, but how normal he had seemed. Just a guy out camping, polite and quiet, asking to share some warmth. There was no reason to think twice, no warning sign that said danger. He looked like anyone else you'd meet on a trail. Now, whenever I think about camping, I still go, but I keep my circle smaller. I lock my truck. I don't hand out drinks to strangers who wander up to the fire. I don't assume everyone out there is harmless just because the woods feel peaceful. Sometimes, when the fire burns low and the forest around me goes silent, I remember that man's face glowing orange in the dark, his lips moving quietly while the rest of us slept. I think about how easily a single decision could have changed everything. And every time I tell myself the same thing, that maybe it wasn't him, maybe it was just someone who looked like him. But deep down, I know what I saw. I remember the way his eyes looked in the firelight. I remember how the air felt that night. And I know that whatever name he gave us, it wasn't his real one. I remember that night clearly because it started out calm. One of those still, cool evenings where the air feels heavy and the forest goes quiet before dark. I was camping with a few friends deep in a forested area of southern Texas, not far from the border. We picked the spot because it was isolated, far away from any towns or ranches, just us, the trees, and the sound of the wind pushing through the dry brush. It wasn't my first camping trip, but it was one of the few where I felt something heavy in the air. Something that seemed to press down on us as soon as the sun disappeared. We had built our fire in a small clearing that looked like it hadn't been used by anyone in a long time. The ground was dry and cracked under a layer of pine needles, and there were stumps scattered around that made perfect seats. I had a habit of telling stories around campfires, old ones I'd grown up hearing from my grandfather or things I'd read about late at night online. That night, I decided to tell the story of El Silban, the whistling ghost. It wasn't that I believed in it, I just liked how the story played with sound. The idea that a whistle could trick your senses, that the closer it was, the quieter it sounded, always fascinated me. So I started telling it. I described how, on cold nights in remote places like this, people would sometimes hear a whistle coming down a road. I told them how it would start loud, close by, but then grow fainter as it approached, until it sounded like it was far away even though it was right next to you. I went into every little detail, the legend of him sitting down to count skulls, the way his presence meant death was near. The story carried through the firelight, my words flickering with the flames, the glow painting our faces orange against the black woods. When I finished, the fire crackled and popped, sending a few sparks into the air. Nobody said much after that. The forest was dead silent except for the fire and the occasional groan of wood expanding in the heat. I leaned back and looked up at the stars, trying to shake the eerie feeling that comes from telling something like that in the dark. Eventually, one by one, everyone turned in for the night. The fire burned low, and I decided to stay up a little longer. I liked the quiet. I liked watching the embers glow red and fade into gray. The air had dropped colder, and a layer of mist was starting to form low to the ground. It made the trees look taller, their trunks vanishing into the haze. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, a whistle, just a few long notes carried on the wind. It wasn't steady or rhythmic. It wavered, like someone breathing through their teeth. My first thought was that one of my friends was messing with me, maybe trying to spook me after the story. I sat still, listening. The whistle came again, clearer this time. It sounded close, too close. It came from somewhere down the dirt path that led out of the clearing. I waited, expecting it to stop, but it didn't. It rose and fell like someone walking slowly, taking their time. The strange thing was, it didn't echo the way normal sounds did out there. It felt flat, like it was trapped between the trees. I told myself it was nothing. A bird, maybe, or wind cutting through a crack in the valley. I turned back toward the fire and tossed another piece of wood in. The sound hissed and cracked, breaking the stillness. I focused on that for a while, trying not to think about the whistle. But after a few minutes, it came again, softer this time, fainter, like it had drifted away. I tried to pinpoint the direction, but it was impossible to tell. It was one of those sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I strained my ears, but it kept changing distance. One moment it sounded behind me, the next it was across the clearing. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The story of El Silban popped into my head again. The trick of the whistle. Loud means far, quiet means near. I pushed the thought away, annoyed at myself for even letting it creep in. Legends were just that, stories, but I couldn't help how real it felt in that moment. Sitting there alone, the fire dying down and the forest growing darker around me. I picked up my flashlight and swept it around the clearing. The beam cut through the mist, lighting up the trunks of the trees. The forest floor looked empty. No movement, no eyes reflecting the light. Just silence. The whistle came again. This time it was barely audible. A thin, trembling note that seemed to float right past my ear. I stood up slowly. My heart was hammering now, not because I believed it was something supernatural, but because my brain couldn't explain it. The logical part of me said it had to be something natural, maybe a coyote, maybe a person out on the trail. But what kind of person would be out here this late, whistling in the dark woods? I decided to check. I wasn't far from my truck, maybe a 15-minute walk through the trees and down the dirt road. I figured if it really was someone, I'd rather see them than sit around imagining things. I threw on my jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and started walking toward the path where I thought the sound had come from. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. The fog was thicker now, curling between the trees and swallowing my beam of light. Every few steps I stopped to listen. At first, there was nothing but the crunch of leaves under my boots. Then I heard the whistle again. Softer, much softer. It was right there, somewhere to my left. I turned the flashlight, sweeping it across the brush. My pulse quickened when I thought I saw movement, but it was just a tree branch swaying. I took another few steps and froze. Something pale flashed in the light, low to the ground, barely visible through the mist. I crouched, squinting. It looked like a piece of fabric, maybe torn cloth caught on a branch. I walked closer and saw that it was an old straw hat lying in the dirt. The brim was half rotted, the top crushed in. It looked like it had been out there for years. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. It was damp, heavy, and smelled of earth. I set it back down and took a step backward. That was when I heard the whistle again. So close it felt like it came from right behind my head. I spun around, shining the light in every direction. Nothing, just trees and fog and silence pressing in. My throat went dry. I stood there for what felt like minutes, barely breathing, waiting for something to move, but there was nothing. Finally, I turned and walked back toward camp, forcing myself not to run. The sound followed me, always faint, always there. When I got back to the fire, it had almost burned out completely. I threw on the rest of the wood and watched it flare up, trying to shake off the unease. The whistle stopped. The forest went still again. I sat there until dawn. I didn't sleep at all. When the light finally came through the trees, the mist lifted and everything looked normal again. The fire pit, the tents, the dirt path. It was like the night had erased itself. Later that morning, when everyone woke up, I didn't mention what I'd heard. I didn't want to sound paranoid or scare anyone. But when I went to the edge of the clearing to get some water from the cooler, I noticed something on the ground. Footprints. They weren't ours. They were deeper, longer strides, pressed into the dirt and leading straight up to where I had been sitting by the fire. There were only a few of them, spaced unevenly, like whoever made them had been standing still for a while before walking off toward the trees. I followed them a short distance before they vanished into the underbrush. The ground there was covered with leaves, and the trail just ended. I stood there for a while, staring into the woods, thinking about the whistle and the hat and how it all lined up too closely with that old story. Still, I didn't say anything to anyone. We packed up later that day and drove back to town. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the sound and how it had changed. Loud at first, then fading until it was almost gone. I thought about how that meant it was close, not far away. How I had heard it whisper right past my ear. That night, back home, I lay in bed with the window cracked open. The air was still, the neighborhood quiet. I tried to convince myself that what happened was just coincidence. Maybe the wind, maybe my imagination getting carried away after a ghost story. But just before I fell asleep, I thought I heard it again. A faint, trembling whistle, far off but familiar. I sat up and listened. It was so quiet I could barely tell if it was real. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. Didn't. It grew softer, then faded until I couldn't tell if I was hearing it or just remembering it. I didn't sleep much that night, and the next morning I checked outside. Everything was normal. No footprints, no hat, no sign of anything. But since that trip, I haven't told the story of El Silban again around a campfire. Not because I'm afraid of ghosts or curses or old legends, but because I learned something that night about how real fear works. It doesn't come from the dark or from what you can see. It comes from what you can't explain when the world goes silent and the air feels like it's watching you. And sometimes, when the wind cuts through the trees just right, and I catch a soft, almost human whistle drifting through the air, I still freeze for a second. Not because I believe the legend is real, but because I know how easily a story can follow you home. I don't know why I ever thought camping alone was a good idea. Maybe it was the need to clear my head, to get away from everything for a few days. Life in the city had been wearing me down. Noise, people, traffic, always something. I thought a few nights under the trees would reset me. That was my mistake. It was early September when I packed up my gear and drove out toward a provincial park in northern Ontario. The plan was simple. Hike a few miles off the main trail, set up camp by one of the lakes, spend 3 nights, then head home. I'd gone camping before, but always with friends. This time, I wanted quiet. I wanted to be alone with nothing but the sound of the woods. The road into the park turned into gravel after about an hour, winding through thick pine forest. I parked near an old logging trail and hiked in with my pack. The air smelled sharp, like sap and wet dirt. The farther I walked, the quieter it got. No engines, no voices, just wind moving through branches. I remember thinking it felt peaceful, almost cleansing. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was low and the surface of the water was still. I found a small clearing on a rise above the shore, cleared a spot for my tent, and started gathering wood. It felt like I was the only person within miles. That isolation made me feel strangely powerful at first, like I'd found something pure again. But that feeling didn't last. The first sign that something was off came around dusk. I was sitting by the fire, watching the light fade across the water, when I noticed a shape far down the opposite bank. It looked like a person standing just at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the reflection of a tree or a rock. But when I squinted, I was sure it moved. I watched for a while, and the shape didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, still as a post, until darkness swallowed it up completely. I tried to brush it off. Maybe another camper, maybe a hiker passing through. But I hadn't seen any vehicles parked near the trailhead, and I hadn't passed anyone on the way in. Still, I told myself it was fine. People camp in the same areas all the time. That night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every little sound in the forest seemed closer than it should have been. The snapping of twigs, the rustle of leaves. I barely slept. When I got up in the morning, the first thing I did was walk down to the lake to see if there were any footprints or signs of someone being across the water. The mud near the edge was smooth, undisturbed. No tracks, no ashes from a fire, nothing. I hiked a few miles that day to explore, trying to push the weirdness out of my head. But even in daylight, the woods felt heavy. There was this constant sense of being followed, though I never saw anyone. The deeper I went, the more I noticed small things that didn't fit. Broken branches at shoulder height, disturbed patches of moss, even what looked like a freshly cut piece of bark on one of the trees. It felt like someone had been there not long before me. By the time I got back to camp, I was uneasy. I told myself to eat, get some rest, and pack up early in the morning. That night, the sound came. It started slow, a faint crunching, like someone walking on the pine needles near the edge of camp. I froze in my sleeping bag and listened. The sound would stop, then start again, closer each time. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was an animal, but the steps were too steady, too deliberate. When I finally sat up and unzipped the tent just enough to peek through, I didn't see anything. The fire had burned low, just red coals glowing faintly, but the woods beyond them were completely still, and that stillness felt wrong. It wasn't the calm silence of nature. It was the kind of silence where even the animals are quiet because something else is there. I waited for a long time before lying back down. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up just before sunrise, I felt a jolt of panic before I even opened my eyes. The first thing I noticed was that the fire had been rebuilt. I'd let it die out before sleeping, but now it was burning low again, like someone had added fresh wood. The smell of smoke was strong. I stumbled out of the tent, heart pounding. There were footprints in the dirt near the pit, boot prints, not mine. They circled the camp once, then disappeared into the trees toward the trail. I stood there for a long time listening. Nothing. No voices, no movement. Whoever it was had already gone. That was enough for me. I packed up as fast as I could, barely stopping to eat. I wanted to be out of there before whoever it was came back. The hike back to my truck felt endless. Every sound made me spin around, certain I'd see someone behind me. When I finally reached the road, I threw my gear in the back seat and got in. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys. The drive out felt like escaping something invisible that might still be following me. It wasn't until I was an hour down the highway that I started to breathe normally again. I pulled over at a gas station and just sat there for a while, staring at the dashboard, realizing how close that could have gone wrong. When I got home, I couldn't stop replaying the details. The figure across the lake, the rebuilt fire, the footprints. I thought about how quietly someone would have to move to do all that without waking me up. I even checked my pack and my truck for anything missing, but everything was there. Whoever it was hadn't taken anything. They'd just been there. For weeks after, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound in my apartment made me jump. I kept thinking about what their plan had been. Were they watching to see if I was alone? Were they waiting for me to fall asleep completely? Did something interrupt them before they could do whatever they'd come for? The scariest part wasn't what happened. It was what didn't. The fact that I'd been completely vulnerable, deep in the woods, and someone had walked into my camp, stood a few feet from me, and then left without a trace. Now, whenever someone mentions going camping, I just shake my head. I can't explain it without sounding paranoid, but that trip changed the way I see the woods. I used to love that silence, the clean smell of pine and dirt. Now it feels like a trap, like an open stage where anything can walk in and you wouldn't know until it was right in front of you. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how easy it would have been for whoever was out there to do whatever they wanted. No witnesses, no signal, no one for miles. They didn't even have to rush. They could have sat by my fire, watched me sleep, walked away, and I'd never have known. It's strange how something so small, just footprints, a burning fire, a shape across the water, can stick with you. It's been years now, but I still haven't gone back to the woods. If I learned anything from that trip, it's that there's a difference between being alone and being isolated. Alone feels peaceful. Isolated feels like something's watching, waiting for you to realize how far away help really is. That's the part that still gets me. The realization that I didn't even hear them come or go. That I'll never know who it was or what they wanted. Every time I think back to that night, the only thing that comes to mind is simple and clear. It was sometime in January of 2016 or 2017. I can't remember exactly which year, but it was deep in the winter and the weather in the mountains of California was miserable. The kind of cold that seeps into your hands even through gloves, the kind that turns your breath into a steady fog that hangs in front of your face. The campground we had driven to was completely empty, not surprising for that time of year. It was tucked into a valley not far from a small river that wound through the pines. There were about a dozen campsites along a narrow dirt loop, all of them vacant. The air was heavy with moisture, and every sound seemed to carry: the creaking of trees, the running of the river, the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deep in the woods. I had taken the trip mainly to get away from things for a few days. I brought my old husky, Cody, because I never went anywhere without him. He was aging but still sharp, still full of that alert, intelligent energy that huskies always seem to have. He'd been camping with me dozens of times before, and I trusted his instincts more than anything else. When we arrived, the light was already fading, and a low fog had started to creep in from the river, hanging close to the ground. I set up camp close to the water, not too close, but within earshot of the soft, constant rush of it. I pitched the tent quickly, my hands numb from the cold, and then got a small fire going. The wood was damp, so it took a while to catch. Every time I thought I had a decent flame, the smoke would shift with the wind and sting my eyes, forcing me to step back. I could hear Cody pacing around the edge of the light, sniffing at the air, his tail low. He was uneasy, but I figured it was the weather. Everything in the woods that night felt a little off. The wind would die completely for a few seconds, then suddenly gust hard enough to make the tent fabric snap and the trees groan. Once the fire settled into a steady crackle, I pulled out my small camp stove and started cooking a late dinner. It must have been close to 8 or 9 p.m. by then, completely dark except for the lantern light and the dim orange glow of the coals. The rain from earlier had stopped, but the ground was slick and the air thick with that wet smell of pine and dirt. I remember stirring something in a pan, beans and rice maybe, when Cody suddenly froze. His ears went up, and his entire body went stiff. I didn't even notice at first, too focused on stirring and keeping the fire from going out. Then he growled. Not a normal growl either, a deep, drawn-out rumble that came from somewhere in his chest. I looked up, and his eyes were locked on the darkness beyond the lantern's reach, toward the direction of the river. His fur stood up all along his back. I could barely see the outline of his body against the shadows. I followed his gaze but saw nothing but the thick wall of brush that lined the water. At first, I thought it might have been another animal, a deer maybe, since we were close to the river. But then he started barking. Loud, sharp, rapid barks that echoed through the trees and bounced back at us. It wasn't his usual bark. There was panic in it. He lunged a few steps toward the dark, pulling against his leash so hard I had to grab it to stop him from running off. I could hear the river clearly now, the rush of it louder than before, and somewhere in between the noise of the water and Cody's barking, I thought I heard movement. I picked up my headlamp from the table and flipped it on. The beam cut through the mist and lit up the brush beyond the edge of the lantern's glow. For a second, everything was just trees, rocks, and shadows. Then, maybe 15 or 20 yards away, I saw them, two eyes reflecting back at me, glowing pale green in the light, perfectly still, low to the ground. For a split second, I didn't process what I was looking at. Then the shape around the eyes came into focus. Sleek, tan fur, a round head, and long shoulders. It was a mountain lion. Its body was partly hidden behind the brush, but I could see enough. It was crouched low, staring directly at me and my dog. I froze. My heart felt like it had stopped completely. The lion didn't move at first. It just stared, completely calm, unbothered by the barking. Its eyes looked unreal in the light, unblinking and cold. It was close enough that I could make out the muscle under its coat, the faint rise and fall of its breathing. Cody was going insane, lunging and screaming, but the cat didn't flinch. It was terrifying how still it was, like it was studying us, deciding what to do. After maybe 2 or 3 seconds, it turned its head slightly, then stood up, smooth and quiet, and walked off into the brush. The movement was so fluid it barely made a sound. I followed it with the headlamp until I couldn't see the eyes anymore. Then it was gone. Completely gone. The woods felt dead silent after that. Even Cody stopped barking, though he was still shaking, pulling at the leash, whining under his breath. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, sweeping the light back and forth, trying to catch another glimpse of it. Nothing. Just the fog, the river, and the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. I finally backed up toward the fire, still holding the light out toward the darkness. I added more wood to the flames and kept it burning bright. Cody stayed right next to me, glued to my leg, ears pinned back. I could feel his body trembling against mine. Every few minutes he'd lift his head, sniff the air, and let out a low growl. I didn't sit down again that night. I just kept pacing around the fire, checking the tree line, trying to listen through the sound of the river. I knew mountain lions rarely attack people, but being alone in that empty campground, hours from anyone else, made that knowledge feel useless. Every time the wind moved through the brush, I imagined it coming back, circling closer. My headlamp battery was starting to dim, so I turned on the lantern to its brightest setting and kept the fire going until it was nothing but glowing coals. When I finally crawled into the tent, Cody refused to go in at first. He sat at the entrance, staring out toward the river, ears pricked. I pulled him inside and zipped the tent shut, but he stayed alert all night, head up, eyes wide open. I barely slept. Every noise outside made my chest tighten. The snapping of a branch, the splash of water, the wind pushing through the trees. I kept picturing those eyes glowing in the dark, watching us. By morning, the fog had lifted, and the ground was covered in frost. When I stepped out of the tent, everything looked peaceful, quiet, almost normal again. The fire pit was cold, the river moved steady, and sunlight cut through the trees. But when I walked down toward the water, I saw fresh tracks in the mud, large, round paw prints leading along the edge of the river, right where I'd seen those eyes. They were close, much closer than I'd realized the night before. I stood there for a long moment, staring at them, trying to picture how quietly that animal must have moved, how long it might have been watching before Cody noticed it. That thought stayed with me the whole time I packed up camp. The fact that I might not have seen anything if my dog hadn't lost his mind. As I loaded the truck and looked back one last time at the campsite, everything looked harmless again. Just pine trees, damp soil, and a cold river. But it didn't feel harmless. The forest looked different after that night, more alive, more aware. I could almost feel eyes in the distance even when I knew they weren't there. I've camped a lot since then, but I always think about that night. The silence before Cody barked, the eyes reflecting back through the mist, the slow, deliberate way that Cat disappeared into the dark like it had all the time in the world. You don't forget that kind of stare. If there's one thing I learned from it, it's that you should always bring your dog camping. You might not see what's out there until it's already too close, but your dog will. I came across the phrase almost by accident, and I still don't know what to make of it. It was a short winter hike that turned into something much stranger. One of those moments that sticks in your head because nothing about it adds up, even when you go over it 100 times later. It was mid-January, a time of year when the mountains north of Wenatchee were mostly deserted except for the occasional snowshoer or hunter. I'd taken a few days off work and wanted to do a solo hike through an old service road that led into the foothills. I liked going in winter. The air was quiet, the woods seemed asleep, and the fresh snow made the whole place feel untouched. The only risk was the cold, but I had the right gear and enough experience to handle it. The day started clear. I parked at the end of a plowed road where the snow started piling up too high for cars. The sky was pale blue, and my breath came out in soft clouds as I strapped on my snowshoes. The forest was still, only the faint crunch of snow beneath me breaking the silence. The trees around me were tall and skeletal, the kind that creak slightly when the wind slides through them. I followed the path uphill for the first few miles. It wasn't a marked trail, just an old logging road that wound up into the hills before splitting into a few overgrown directions. The snow was knee-deep in some areas, crusted with ice on top, and it reflected the morning sun like glass. I liked the solitude of it, the feeling of being alone in something so big and empty. By midday, clouds started rolling in from the west. The light flattened out, the brightness fading until the snow looked gray. The temperature dropped, and I pulled my hood tight and kept moving. My plan was to reach a small clearing about 6 miles in, have a quick meal, and then head back before the weather turned. When I reached the clearing, I stopped to catch my breath. The snow was untouched, smooth except for a few animal tracks, maybe deer or fox, crossing the far edge. I took off my pack, dug out a thermos of coffee, and sat on a fallen log to rest. That's when I noticed it. About 30 feet away, in the center of the clearing, there were words written in the snow. Perfect block letters, carved shallow but clean, each one about a foot tall. The snow around them was smooth, no footprints leading in, no sign of anyone kneeling or using their hands. The phrase read, "Per audacia ad ignotum." I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. I didn't know much Latin, but I'd seen enough to recognize a few roots. Later, I learned it meant something like "through audacity toward the unknown." The weird part wasn't just the phrase, it was how it was written. The snow was soft and powdery. You couldn't walk on it without leaving deep prints. Yet there were none. Not around the words, not leading toward them. It was as if the letters had just appeared there. At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of frozen illusion. Maybe the snow had melted slightly and refrozen in a strange pattern. But when I walked closer, I could see that the letters were carved deep into the snow, with compacted walls like someone had traced them with a stick. I walked around the area, checking for any signs of human presence, tracks, poles, anything. There was nothing. Standing there, the silence felt different. I don't know how to describe it, not ominous, exactly, but heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I could hear the faint hum of wind through the trees, the distant crack of ice shifting on branches, but underneath that was just emptiness. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos. Then I backed up to the edge of the clearing and looked around again. I still couldn't find any sign of how those words had been made. For a minute, I tried to come up with rational explanations. Maybe someone had made them the day before and new snow had fallen lightly overnight, covering the tracks but leaving the depressions visible. But the snow looked too fresh for that. The air had that sharp stillness that only happens right after a storm, untouched and perfect. I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly, just that prickling sense that something wasn't adding up. I stood there longer than I probably should have, staring at the words, the way the gray light made the carved letters look darker, almost blue. Then, without really deciding to, I packed up and started heading back down the mountain. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. There was no one there, of course. The forest was quiet, the snow absorbing all sound. The clouds had thickened now, turning the sky a dull silver. My tracks stretched cleanly behind me in a straight line. I could see them clearly for yards. That's what kept bothering me. How clear my own tracks were, how impossible it would be to walk across snow that deep and leave none. I moved faster on the way down, feeling the cold bite harder with every step. A few flakes started drifting down, soft and slow at first. I didn't stop again until I reached the car. When I finally sat inside and turned on the heater, I realized how tense I'd been. My hands were shaking a little. That night, back home, I looked through the photos I'd taken. The words were perfectly visible, the edges crisp and symmetrical. The snow around them was completely smooth. I zoomed in as far as I could, trying to catch something. A shadow, a mark, a hint of disturbance, but there was nothing. Out of curiosity, I searched the phrase online. Came up a few times, mostly on old forums and blogs about Latin mottos. It was sometimes translated as "through boldness to the unknown." That was fine enough on its own, but one of the results was a short post from almost 10 years earlier, written by someone describing a similar encounter. They said they'd found the same phrase, "per audacia ad ignotum," carved into snow near the summit of a mountain in Oregon. The strange part was how they described it. No tracks, no signs of anyone around, just the letters alone. The post ended abruptly, with the person saying they'd gone back a few days later and found the spot covered in new snow. No trace left. I remember sitting there staring at that post, reading it over and over, the exact phrasing matching what I had seen. It wasn't proof of anything, just an odd coincidence, but it made my skin crawl a little. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not friends, not coworkers. It just felt too strange to explain without sounding dramatic. But sometimes, when I go hiking in the winter, I think about that clearing again. About how quiet it was, how fresh the snow looked, how clean those words appeared. It's easy to imagine someone playing a trick, but the logistics don't make sense. You can't float over snow to carve letters like that. You can't make something that perfect without leaving signs of your presence. I don't think there's any hidden meaning or mystical secret to it. Just something that happened that doesn't fit neatly into what we understand. Maybe it was an elaborate prank. Maybe wind, ice, and chance worked together just right to form something that looked intentional. I'll probably never know. But the next time I went hiking in the snow, I paid attention to every detail. The way my steps looked, how easily footprints form, how snow shifts and compacts. I found myself glancing over open areas, half expecting to see words waiting there again. I never did. Still, I remember standing in that clearing, the pale light filtering through the clouds, staring at those words written so cleanly in untouched snow. It was something that didn't belong there, something made by no one, meant for no one. Even now, I can picture it perfectly. Per audacia ad ignotum, through audacity toward the unknown. I guess that's exactly what I did that day, stepped a little too far into the unknown. And whatever made those words, whoever or whatever caused them to appear, left me with a reminder that not everything in the wilderness follows logic. Sometimes the strangest things don't come with answers. They just happen once, quietly, leaving you to wonder what kind of person or what kind of world could leave something like that behind without a single trace.